Hello, good evening, and welcome to this Humanists UK event about the census 2021. My name's Andrew Copson. I'm the Chief Executive of Humanists UK. I have been now for just over a decade, which means that you've calculated it correctly. I remember the last census campaign, and really not much has changed between then and now, because the request that Humanists UK is making of people who don't believe in or practice a religion this time around in the census is exactly the same as the request we made last time. If you're not religious, say so. Tick that no religion box. And this matters for reasons that we'll discuss this evening. But first of all, I want to explain what we're going to be using this video for today. So obviously, at this time of COVID restrictions, people aren't wandering around in the same way they were in 2011. They can't see billboards on tube stations, on the sides of buses and in public areas, which means a lot of the advocacy work that we have to do to persuade people or to help them to understand what and why they should respond to the religion question on the census has to be online. And as a result of that, we will be using a lot more video. And so some of the questions that you ask this evening, and the question and answer box is open for you to ask any questions. Some of the questions that you asked this evening and my answers will form part of the video resources that we use in this campaign. So thank you for being here to help produce the resources for this campaign. Like I say, we can't do billboards. We also can't do leafleting house to house, which was such an important part of the campaign in 2011. It's all online now. We're confident in our ability to communicate the messages in the right way online, but you're really helping by being here this evening and asking your questions. If you want to tweet about the census, we're suggesting you use the hashtags #TickNoReligion and #Census2021. The Office for National Statistics, which runs the census, is generally actually quite happy to support campaigns that encourage the public to fill it in, whatever else those campaigns might be encouraging people to do. So it's just possible that those hashtags might help us gain some additional traction for this campaign, at least online. Some of you will already be familiar with the census question and the background to it, but I'll say a little bit about that at the beginning before we get into questions which are already flooding in. The census question on religion was first asked in 2001. So this is the third time that data on this question will have been collected. And we were active with the government at the time that that question was being designed over 20 years ago now, to try and communicate to them the necessity of having a question that would reveal and uncover the sort of data the government actually wanted. And the government of the day said that the reason they wanted this data was to understand people's religious affiliations and where they might be found at places of worship or in the community, so as to understand better the sort of public policy implications of people's religiosity. We said that if they wanted to do that, they needed to ask a question that very clearly would determine people's real religious beliefs, practices, and identities. They took a different view, and instead they used a question that, as they said themselves, would maximize religious responses. So the fact that the census question overinflates the number of people recorded as being religious in the various nations of the UK is not an accident, it's by design. That would be okay if the data then that was gathered in the census was treated as if it was just cultural affiliation data. But of course, in practice, it's not treated as if it's cultural affiliation data. It's treated as if the people who tick religious boxes really mean it, that they are practicing, worshipping, identifying primarily even. Some government departments use this data as if it is people who tick a religious box are expressing their primary identity. We know that's not true. So for the last 20 years, since the bad decision was taken to ask this leading and biased question, we've continued to engage with government and various agencies, including the Office for National Statistics, the ONS. They, as I say to us that they use the data as data on cultural affiliation, but that's not how it's interpreted in practice. And so even now we have tried to have the question changed, but it's clear that's not going to happen now. Although the data is used by almost all service providers as measures of belief and strong religious identity, it's not the ONS doesn't accept that is the case. And they also want to preserve compatibility between censuses. And this is a more decent argument. You can't map change over time unless you've got consistency in the question. To some extent, that's interesting for us, and we sort of agree with it, because then the census will record properly change over time, which is the growing of the non-religious. That's what we expect to see this time as well. But anyway, it's almost redundant to discuss that because the question isn't going to change. Okay, let's move to your questions in the hope that some of these will be useful in helping us produce the resources that we've talked about. Here's a good question. Other surveys, including the British Social Attitudes Survey, show that a majority of people, over 52%, are not religious. So why is it that the census says that most people are Christians? Why are these results so different? That's an excellent question. The reason for it is the leading nature of the question in the census. The census doesn't ask, do you have a religion? And if so, what is it? The census asks what your religion is, presuming thereby that you have a religion. And it encourages people, even who have no religious beliefs, even who don't have any religious practices, it leads them into ticking a religious box. And we know from academic research that the reasons why they do that are various. It might be that they were baptized as a child, or they feel a cultural affiliation or a family attachment or an ethnic connection with some religion or another. They may have a very loose affiliation with it. Perhaps they attended a religious school. But in other measures, like the one that the question asks about, the British Social Attitudes Survey, the question asked is, do you have a religion, yes or no? And when you actually ask people that question, when you make it clear that no is an option, that's when you get the majority of people saying no. And by those measures, of course, Britain is one of the least religious societies, not just in Europe, but on the planet. So that's a really important question. Thank you for that. I saw online, this is a new question. I saw online many people saying that when you look at more data, a lot of non-religious people still do believe in things like gods and fairies and angels and life after death. Is that true? Well, this is a good question. Of course, it is the case that identity as being religious or not religious doesn't tell you everything about anyone's beliefs. And so there are some people who have no religious identity who nonetheless have some beliefs that are not completely rational, completely secular, or completely humanist. Having said that, the extent to which this is true is overplayed. So, for example, in YouGov surveys, you find that about 7% of people who say they're not religious and they don't believe in God also believe in some other sort of spiritual concepts. 7%, that's not very much at all. In fact, I would flip this question around and say that many, many people who say they have a Christian identity don't believe in God, don't go to church, don't have religious beliefs. So I think if the question is going to mislead, it's more likely to mislead in that direction. Okay. There is a campaign, here's a question. There is a campaign to put down your religion as climate concerned. What are the positives and negatives for this? This is something that people often recommend. Every time there's a census, there are lots of campaigns, political or social, sometimes comedic campaigns, like the one you might remember about encouraging people to put Jedi down as their religion. Putting Jedi down as your religion, by the way, it may seem funny, but really, it's better to tick no religion instead. If you protest against the question by writing something ridiculous in like Jedi, it doesn't do any good. Whereas the more people who explicitly identify as non-religious, the better chance we have of getting inclusive public service reforms, changes to the rate and number and expansion of religious faith schools, and so on and so forth. So it's not good to joke in your answer, but when we think about putting something maybe more serious like climate concerned, if people want to send a message, that's really not a good idea either. Firstly, that data probably won't be counted and aggregated in any meaningful sense. Secondly, even if a few people put down climate concerned, you'll end up having certainly not a majority of people putting down climate concern. So even if you've got a cause where you think, yes, let's try and get this as the answer in the census, you can actually find out that you've shot yourself in the foot with that, because you might find that so few people write that down that it really underestimates the percentage of people in a population who really do care about this issue. So you can it can be something of a Pyrrhic victory. And the other point about not raising climate concerned is that it just won't do any good. I mean, no, public bodies, when they're allocating resources, are not going to care whether you're climate concerned or not. But saying no religion, if you're not religious, will achieve a public policy outcome. It is something constructive. What kinds of government decisions are based on the census religion figures? Well, of course, we don't know how the figures will be used in the future, but in the last decade or so, references to religion in the census have been used in relation to, we calculate, public policy decisions over at least 20 different subject areas. So there have been instances in education provision where census data has been used to justify the growth of state-funded religious schools, for example, faith schools. They are used to justify then school transport funding decisions. On a big constitutional level, census figures have been used to justify things like the continuing establishment of the Church of England on the grounds that most people are Christian, and the continuing existence of bishops in the legislature. They're used as benchmarks for equalities monitoring that public bodies might do about their service provision or about their employment. For example, the BBC, in one meeting recently about their diversity and representation, noted that Christians were underrepresented at the BBC because the census showed that most people were Christian, whereas most people working at the BBC weren't Christian. That's a very vivid example of where misleading data has a big impact. The census data has been used in relation to questions of marriage law reform. It's been used in the asylum system. It's been used in justifying Britain's position on some foreign policy issues. So, for example, some people have said that the reason why Britain should be particularly concerned with the persecution of Christians in other countries rather than the persecution of other religious minorities or the non-religious is because Britain is a Christian country, has historic links to Christianity, is a present Christian country, and so should be having that at the top of their agenda. So really, there's no end to the policies and public policy and resource allocation decisions that the census has influenced. Here's a technical question just about the campaign. Will there be electronic resources produced by Humanists UK that we can share on Facebook and social media? Yes, there will be, absolutely. So we will definitely be emailing people about that. Lots of suggestions in the questions about in the questions here about what a better question could be, and they're all very good. So, for example, a question being, do you follow a religion? Do you follow an organized religion? Are you a member of any religion? And so on and so forth. And as I said a moment ago, there are many good better questions and better results as well from places like the British Social Attitudes Survey, which one of our questioners mentioned. But really, the Office for National Statistics is highly unlikely now to change the question, although we continue to argue it because we still think that even for comparability reasons, it's still not better to use a bad question than a good question for the future. But nonetheless, I think the question is certainly too late for this year. And so although there are lots of good suggestions being made in the questions here about questions, they are not likely to be able to do it. There's not a question here about whether we'll be doing newspaper adverts. Yes, we've been looking into this. It's true, as this questioner says, Angela, that billboards and leafleting is obviously currently out of the question, but we could do newspaper ads. And we're looking to place ads in newspapers that are where we know there's a particular demographic that we need to reach. So the very particular audience for this campaign, and maybe I'll just make this clear again, the very particular audience for this campaign is people who they don't have any religious beliefs, they don't have any religious practices. If you asked them, are you religious, would say no. But when faced with the question, what is your religion, and a list of religious responses, they're inclined to tick Christian or Sikh or Jewish or Muslim or whatever. And from the research done on the census data and people who did tick religious boxes in spite of not having religious beliefs or religious identities, we know that these people are persuadable when you point out to them the consequences of ticking a religious box. So they may be ticking a religious box for, like I said earlier, cultural affiliation or family connection, or ethnic associations. That's often the case with people who might tick Jewish or Sikh, for example. They're not religious, but they feel an ethnic affiliation to those particular identities. But when we explain to people what the use of the census data is and how, in spite of what you think you're saying when you tick that box, the way that that data is used is by assuming that you are religious, really religious, completely religious, then people often think again. And that's our focus here. So we'll be focusing press ads where we can put them out on audiences where we know there are people of that demographic. Do you think it would be valuable to capture data about the number of humanists, not simply capture as no religion? And what about other named non-religious worldviews? So this is a question from Jane. This is a very good question, and one where our position is, as an organisation, Humanists UK, is very clear. So some people say, yeah, I'll tick no religion in the census, but I will also write in humanist, or I will write in atheist, or I'll write in, agnostic or something else. Or, I'll tick other and write in humanist. That is not a good thing to do. Firstly, if people do that, it will always lead to a massive underrepresentation of those positions, because when the figures are published of the census, not just nationally but in local areas, what you will find is a very small number of people have written in humanist, and we could never do such nationwide publicity that we could ever get it as big, even as our own membership, for example. In practice, people wouldn't hear that message, they wouldn't write it in. So you'll find a very small number of people have written that in, and that actually does us harm. So, for example, at the moment in Wales, we're engaged in lobbying about the RE curriculum, and the Christian Institute, which is a Christian lobby group, have been lobbying against humanism being included. And as one of their arguments against humanism being included, they've said, look how small the number of people who wrote humanist in the census was, right? So far from doing good, that has actually done harm to our cause. So that's the practical reason why you shouldn't write in various non-religious worldviews or tick other and put a non-religious worldview of some sort in. That's a practical reason why you shouldn't. But there's a principled reason too, which is that humanism is not a religion. And so in answer to the question, what is your religion? Giving the answer humanism doesn't make sense. And we don't want to give the impression that that does make sense. And if the question were, what do you identify as belonging to any particularly named religion or belief? And then there was a long list of all different religions and beliefs, maybe then it would be worth ticking humanists. And of course, many people would, because the option would be there and the question would be different. But under the present situation with the census as it is, that does not make sense. This looks like simply a question out of curiosity. Helen asks, who can influence the nature or type of questions asked in the census? Well, ultimately, the questions that are to be asked in the census decided by Parliament, and that's as a result, though, of different public bodies expressing their views about what data would be useful for their purposes, and that does change over time, of course, but in relation to the religion question being introduced in 2001, what some public bodies were saying, and the Blair government at the time particularly, was that they wanted, in particular, a breakdown of British Asians by religion, because for public policy purposes, they believed they needed to make distinctions between people on that basis. There's a question here about one very specific public policy, and the question is, to what extent do the faith school organisations rely on census data to justify their state subsidies? Well, faith schools, of course, are not just state subsidized. Their running costs are entirely met by the state. And the answer to the question is a lot. Census data is used extensively and relied on heavily, especially to justify the growth of state-funded religious schools in England, and especially to justify the growth and maintenance of Christian faith schools in England as well, although it's used across the board for all religious schools, Muslim, Jewish, and so on, but especially to justify the maintenance of Christian schools. And we find that all the time. We find that in our work with members of parliament. We find that in our work with the Department for Education, but we also find it, and this is crucially important, in our work with local authorities when we are joining with parents to try and oppose, for example, a new religious school opening up. And local authorities use census data a lot. And so if there is an artificially inflated level of religiosity in census data as a result of people not ticking no religion when they don't have any religious beliefs or identities, that affects on the ground what type of schools will open. And it makes it more likely that new religious schools will be opened, even though the population doesn't want them. There's one question here about how the data is used, is asking, is there a way to highlight the misrepresentation of the data generated by the question to the ONS or some other body? Well, the ONS is aware of how its data is misused. And so we have been doing that for quite some time now, for almost, in fact, 20 years. And they do say that they would like to see that corrected and that they will provide further guidance to public bodies and so on and so forth. But really, that even guidance from the ONS doesn't scratch the surface of the problem, because people who are going to use this data, public bodies who are going to use this data, they see the data. Some people have got time for footnotes. Some people have got times for caveats. Most people haven't. They just see the data, X-Christian, X% Christian, X% Muslim. It is what it is, and they use it, they copy it, they paste it, they put it in their consultation document, whatever. So there isn't much room in reality for nuance. Is it possible to approach the BBC to request this message be conveyed through their channels in order to ensure accuracy for the census? No, I don't think that would be possible, unfortunately. We will be seeking media coverage, though, for this campaign. In 2011, although in a very different, context, because at the moment media is dominated by the COVID pandemic. But in 2011, we were successful in getting significant media coverage for this. Largely that was probably because of the novelty of the issue. It was the first time we're making the argument. And so we would expect probably a reduction in the level of publicity that we're able to achieve this time around through the media. And it is incredibly difficult to get media coverage for anything at the moment that isn't COVID related. But we will be trying to get media coverage for this. Okay, what question do we have here? How does census data influence decisions about what to teach in religious education syllabuses? Again, as with the question about faith schools, a really important question. Many bodies that are writing religious education syllabuses, both in England and Wales, use census data to determine both who they should ask about the writing of the syllabus. So, they might say, oh, here we've got 60% of Christians, so 6 out of 10 of the people involved in this should be Christian. That's a bit crude, but that you know what I mean. Not only do they do that, so they select the people who are involved in making these decisions on the basis of census data, and they've been known to exclude humanists on that basis in a number of places. They also make decisions about the content, so the different religions and non-religious worldviews that are taught about in the syllabus. And that's really important. There's obviously a consequent impact of the census, therefore, on children's rights when their local RE syllabus is not broad-based and inclusive. There's also an impact on worship in schools, not just the curriculum, but worship in schools, because census data is used in local decision-making about whether or not schools should be allowed to opt out of the Christian nature of collective worship. The flip side of that, of course, is that if we get more accurate data and it shows more and more that greater numbers of both young people and people of parental age are non-religious, then the opposite should start to happen. It should be easier to make the argument for inclusive assemblies. It should be easier to make the argument for broad and inclusive curriculums. And that is one of the aims of course, ultimately of Humanists UK, and one of the reasons why we want public authorities to have accurate data, because it makes our very rational, evidence-based arguments easier to make. And Moira makes a very good point in the questions that even if you do put humanist in, that won't be taken properly into account. And anyway, humanism is not a religion. So as we said earlier, it's quite important that you tick no religion, don't write something else in instead. And also, don't skip the question. Some people think, well, I'm not religious, I'm not even going to touch that question. And that's a problem, because the data on people who don't answer the question is treated separately, of course, from the data on people with no religion. So if people are ignoring the question, if you ignore the question because you want to register a sort of protest about the question being there at all, or because you're not religious and you feel the question has nothing to do with you, you are missing an opportunity to be counted as non-religious, and you are allowing the inflated religious figures to have a greater say in public policy as a result. So don't skip the question either. Fran asks a pointed question here. Won't any answer, meaning the results of the census data, be overridden by religious interests like the Church of England anyway? Well, of course, that's always the risk. There are many powerful and privileged and influential, unfairly privileged religious bodies and individuals, leaders in our country. And often they do get their own way, you know, in spite of the evidence, in spite of the data, in spite of public opinion, and in spite of what would be a better practice and achieve better outcomes for everyone. But although we can't solve every problem at once, getting the census results right would help to undermine those privileged and artificially privileged positions that are held by religious organisations and religious hierarchs. So it's worth doing. And of course, Humanists UK, in all of its work, in all of our work, we try to take on those issues of unfair privilege as well. Now then, question from Sue. When it comes to issues in Parliament, is there any data to show that MPs are influenced by census information in the religion question on votes like, for example, for or against voluntary euthanasia? That's a very interesting question, Sue. And I think the answer is very complicated. But broadly speaking, I would say yes. The way that census data on religion is used, and specifically the way that percentages of religious people are used, you know, is often to associate people who've ticked Muslim or who've ticked Christian or who've ticked, you know, Sikh or Jewish or whatever, Hindu, is often to associate them with all sorts of values, propositions, beliefs and sentiments that in reality, we have absolutely no way of knowing that they have. But nonetheless, the conflation is made between identity ticked in a box on the census form and, for example, opposition to abortion or opposition to assisted dying for the terminally ill, or support for Christian-inspired ethical policies of other types, or support for religious schools and so on and so forth. So yeah, that does happen. And people, especially parliamentarians, are very attentive to demographic questions often in their local areas, questions of wealth and deprivation, questions of race, questions of sex and gender, but also questions of religion. And you know, the data is, things are extrapolated from this data that really the data doesn't support, but it does happen. Colin asks a question, or Colin makes an observation here in the chat. As we discussed earlier, Colin says it can be hard to distinguish between our cultural roots and our religious beliefs. And it's a pity that the census question allows the blurring of these issues. It is a pity, and I'd say two things about it. Firstly, one of the things that we previously advocated, and which the census in Scotland, although that's not taking place this year, actually does, is that you could ask people what religion, if any, they were brought up in, and what religion, if any, they had now. And that would be a very interesting set of data to have. But you know, that isn't what's asked. Another possibility that's been raised to try and deal with the sort of conflation between culture, ethnicity, and religion, is that you could make some boxes like Sikh and Jewish, which are for some people ethnicities, also available in the question on ethnicity in the census, so that, for example, someone who was from a Jewish background and felt a very strong Jewish cultural affiliation, but wasn't religious, could tick Jewish in terms of ethnicity and no religion in terms of religion. At the moment, people in that position have to make a choice. And I was in communication by email just last week with some members of Humanists UK who are Jewish in culture, and were saying how irritating it is for them to have to make the choice in the census between those two things. They said they all decided in the end, I think, that they were going to tick no religion because they didn't want the implication to be that they supported things like, you know, state-funded Jewish schools and so on, and so they decided to tick no religion. But they would have liked to tick Jewish ethnicity, no religion. And there are Sikhs that I've spoken to in a similar position, and there may be other people in that position too. So it would be helpful if there was more nuance in the census, and maybe that will come with time, because, as you know, the census is going to hopefully be largely, they hope, going to be largely online this year, and that does allow for perhaps more questions in the future. There's an excellent question here which touches on what individual people can do and local humanist groups and others can do to help this campaign. And that's a question: would it help if people wrote to their local newspapers highlighting this issue? And yes, it absolutely would. Humanists UK has produced resources and held meetings already for represented local humanist groups to explain to them what they can do locally, but there'll be more information online about what you can do to raise the profile of this issue locally. Writing to your local newspaper is an absolutely brilliant thing to do. A lot of people read the letters pages in their local newspaper, contacting your local radio. Use the messages and the arguments and the facts that are on the Humanists UK pages about the census campaign when you do that, and that will be very good. Greg asks, why don't decision makers take the British Social Attitudes Survey into account as well as the census? Well, that's a really good question, and we do make the argument that they should, and we have had some success by using British Social Attitudes data to demonstrate especially things about religious identity, and to use other data sets as well that exist from places like YouGov or Ipsos Mori about religious beliefs or religious practice, to urge that they be taken into account as being more appropriate in answering the specific policy question that is in front of people at that time. But ultimately, if a public authority is going to use the census, they're not going to be diverted from doing so. And the arguments that they make for using the census instead of British Social Attitudes Survey are largely the fact that it is a public resource. It's produced by the Office for National Statistics. It is official data. So if you're a public body and you don't want to risk doing something that people might challenge, for example, legally or in other ways, your best bet as a public body is to use the official data. And unfortunately, that is the census. And the second thing that public bodies often say, including local authorities, is that it's comprehensive. They use the census because it's comprehensive. By law, everybody has to complete a census return, and so that data is comprehensive in a way they say that the British Social Attitudes Survey never can be. Now, of course, you can try and give these people a lesson in sampling and margins of error and demonstrate to them that the better data is still more useful to them. But there's something easy to grasp about the census. Everyone knows what it is. It has a sort of totemic importance in national life, and national bodies and official bodies are just always going to use it as their go-to source, unfortunately. Now, there's a question here from Northern Ireland. I'm in Northern Ireland. Sorry, I'll start again, not in Northern Ireland. I'm from Northern Ireland, and my family are from an Irish Catholic background. If I put that I'm non-religious, will that put our community at a disadvantage? This is a really important question. And I think it's really interesting to see what the data in Northern Ireland will be like this time around. The answer to your specific question is no, not at all. And specifically in Northern Ireland, there is a separate question, as I was saying, about the religion you were born into, if your parents are religious. That's optional, you don't have to disclose it. But you do have that possibility. So it is possible in Northern Ireland to to talk about your religious background without having to say that you're religious now. And in fact, not only you might want to think not only about wanting not to disadvantage your Catholic family, but you might want to think about how not to disadvantage non-religious people in Northern Ireland, because one of the big challenges that non-religious people face in Northern Ireland is that they are seen automatically often as belonging to one of the two main Christian communities in Northern Ireland. We know that non-religious views in Northern Ireland are actually hugely underrepresented in official surveys for this reason. Humanist marriage has just become legal in Northern Ireland, which we're very pleased about. And it's the fastest growing type of wedding in Northern Ireland, which you would not on the face of the statistics about Northern Ireland, which largely divide people into two religious denominations, you would not expect, but it is the case. And I think that there are non-religious people in Northern Ireland who don't come out, and assert their non-religious identity, and they need to do it on, especially in official data, if people's rights in Northern Ireland are to be respected, an accurate picture of that society and its changes are going to emerge. Michael Dove asks, non-religious identities vary widely by geography. Is the campaign likely to target by geography? And if so, would you target current high or low non-religious areas? That's a very good question. It's absolutely true that, for example, the east of England is hugely disproportionately non-religious, even in the census, compared with the rest of the country. And there are other places of which that's true as well, Brighton, for example. We're not actually going to be able to target online, or it's unlikely that we will target geographically. We'll target in other ways. But it's definitely something to think of for the next census, when we might be able to have billboards again, because I don't know which we would target, actually. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. Yeah, interesting. So someone here makes the point, Alan makes the point, good data on the number of non-religious people in the local area would also help local councillors promote the case for better balance. Many educational authorities have religious advisory committees which don't reflect humanism. That's absolutely right. And I think it comes back to the importance of having accurate data. We don't want inaccurate data which artificially shows that no one is religious and how we've won the secular struggle. We want accurate data so that public resource allocation of public services can properly be planned, and planned against the reality of the social situation that we currently live in. So really, I would like to think that this campaign could be supported by religious people who care about the honest and open and proper allocation of public resources. My parents are very strict Muslims. This is a question. My parents are very strict Muslims. I haven't believed in religion for many years, but the fact that I'm a humanist is a secret, and all my relatives assume I'm still religious. I'm worried about the consequences if they found out, but I do really want to tell the truth on the census and be counted. What should I do? Well, this is a hard question to answer. Of course, everything that I've said about our aims for the census remains true. If you've left a religion and now identify as non-religious, I think you should tick the no religion or none box, depending on where you are in the UK. But I suppose I would also add, only if you do feel it is safe for you to do so. If you're worried that because this is a household survey, you might be in danger if your non-religious identity was known, I would recommend you put your safety first. But you could also get in touch through Humanists UK with the programme known as Faith to Faithless, which works with apostates who are in very religious environments, but who have now had adopted non-religious beliefs for themselves, and they would hopefully be able to support you through that. So tell the truth if it's safe to do so, would be my advice in that situation. Someone from the team at Humanists UK has just popped a little answer into the chat box here for me, based on, in response to a previous question about targeting by geography. And they tell me that on the whole, we're optimizing the online ads to find as many non-religious people as possible, i.e. people who identify as non-religious, regardless of where they live. So there we are. Here's an interesting question. Do you think that many people ticking a box indicating a religion are indulging in Pascal's Wager. So the idea that because you never know, you might as well be religious and identify as religious just in case it's true, because there's no downside to that, where there is a downside to not being religious and hence finding a few seconds after death that you've made the wrong choice and that you're suffering for it. That's Pascal's Wager. No, I don't think that many people are actually doing that, apart from possibly on a subconscious level, because we do know from data by researchers like Abby Day at the University of Sussex, who did some research into people who ticked Christian in 2001, that people who did that largely did it because of cultural sentiment, or because they were raised that way, or because they felt a family affiliation, or in some cases they'd been to a religious school, or their children were currently at a religious school. So there was no evidence that I can recall that it was out of a sort of hedging of bets. But of course, your question does touch on an interesting, broader area to think about, which is the extent to which there are still people who, wobble in their commitment to being religious or not religious, and who come down on the religious side just in case. I don't think that's a very significant category. One person asks, is there a chance that humanists will one day have the same rights and recognition associated with religious identities, i.e. protected against discrimination? Is this something Humanists UK is looking into? Actually, humanists and all non-religious people do have the same legal right to not be discriminated against in employment, in the provision of public services, and in other areas, just as religious people do. In fact, it's the same law that protects the rights of both religious people and non-religious people to that non-discrimination. That's the Equality Act, which also protects people against discrimination on grounds of sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, and a whole cluster of other characteristics. And the way that equality law works in this country is generally that you don't protect a category of person, you protect all people on grounds of a particular characteristic. So, for example, equality law protects you against discrimination on grounds of sex, whether you're a woman being discriminated against on grounds of sex or whether you're a man being discriminated on grounds of sex. So it doesn't make a distinction. And the same is true of discrimination on grounds of religion or belief, which includes non-religious beliefs. So there already is that protection from discrimination. And if you've been discriminated against because of your non-religious identities or beliefs, do contact Humanists UK, because we can put you in touch with lawyers, and we have other advice that we can give. Will the team, Heather asks a very interesting question, which I don't know the answer to actually, but she asks, will the team of people who door knock to help prompt people to complete the census be trained in explaining the questions in a non-biased way? I don't know the answer to that actually. I would imagine no, and I think that because usually the role of these officers is restricted to stimulating people to complete the census rather than assisting them to do so. I think that's for good reasons. But I'll think about that and find out. I won't think about it. I'll find out the facts about that. If anyone from the team is listening and knows, they could put that in here, but not at the moment. So you've just said that humanists should be legally treated in the same way as any religion or non-religious belief, but then telling me that I have to tick that I have no religion. Being a humanist is an important part of my identity, so can I write humanist? Well, I'll say what I said before. We strongly recommend that all non-religious people, no matter what terms you might use to describe yourself, tick the no religion box. Ticking no religion is better than writing in another answer, and much better than not answering at all, because in doing so, you'll be maximizing the only number that counts, the only number that public bodies actually pay attention to, which is the number of people that tick no religion. And as I said earlier, when we write something else, other lobby groups can also try and use this against us. So if there's a very small number of people, for example, who put humanist or atheist or agnostic or whatever, if a very small number of people put down humanist or atheist, it would look as if we were very few in number, when we're not very few in number. We are great in number. And so we would be at a disadvantage, even though you did it out of the best of motives. And like I said, humanism isn't a religion. So in answer, they're not, the census is not asking you, what's your identity in philosophical terms? What's your religion or belief? How would you describe your approach to life? What's your worldview? They're not asking that. They're not interested in that. Whether they should be interested in that is another question. And what they're asking you is what your religion is. And if you're non-religious, you should tick no religion. Has the pandemic affected the census campaign this time? It's not safe to hand out leaflets right now, and people won't see billboards as they did in 2011. Yes, as I said earlier, it definitely has been a factor. The pandemic has been a factor in us scaling back our physical presence during the campaign, such as with billboards and leaflets. But even if the pandemic wasn't a factor, I think we would still be moving more stuff online and seeking to target our adverts digitally. A lot has changed in the past 10 years. Many more people are receiving their news digitally, looking for things online to learn about. This event that we're having right now is something that we wouldn't have done in 2011. The videos that we're making as a result of your questions here and we'll be using in that campaign is a good example of what I've just said, of how people are moving online. And so I think that although the pandemic and the government's restrictions in light of the pandemic have influenced our tactics in this campaign, we would still nonetheless be moving a lot of stuff online as a result. An extremely interesting question here from Lisa. Do you think that fear of growth of other religions encourages some people to declare themselves as Christian when they actually have no religion? That is an extremely interesting question. And in fact, there was some academic research last time that white people in areas where there were a lot of Asian Muslims, according to the census, that white people in areas where there were a lot of Asian Muslims, according to the census, were more likely to tick Christian than white people in areas where there were mostly white people. And when researchers looked in more detail at that, they found that there was a tendency in people in those areas who were white to tick Christian because they weren't Muslims. And it was a sort of reverse statement. Now, those people who are doing that weren't necessarily doing so consciously, as your question implies, but that does show up in the data. Some people undoubtedly do it consciously as well. And I'm afraid we face this sort of argument in a lot of our campaigning work. When we're making arguments about why, for example, there shouldn't be an established church in this country, why it's wrong to privilege one denomination that most people don't share, why it's essential for our equal citizenship that we should have a state that has no religious or worldview affiliation. We get people who are otherwise perhaps supportive of other things we do say things like, well, if we don't have, the Church of England, what's going to happen? Will we become, a Muslim country? Will we become some sort of other religious country? And I think it's a real shame that people feel that way and make those sorts of arguments. Firstly, because it's just demographically unlikely that any of those things would happen. But secondly, the argument about whether or not there should be a fair and equal society is an argument that can be made on its own terms. You don't need to bring in some potential future opponent or fear that. Pursue the right course, which is right morally, ethically, and in this case, in accordance with the data, answer questions honestly, and act with good principles, and you won't go far wrong. That's my view. Now then, someone's making a good comment about Pascal's Wager, that you'd say to God, well, where were you? Why didn't you come and tell me? That was Bertrand Russell's answer, as well as Christopher Hitchens, of course. Will is there any chance of getting on question time to highlight some of these points? Don't know. We'll definitely be, we're hoping for some of the Religion Sunday morning programmes on the BBC, certainly to give coverage to the census issue, and we'll try and get our points across there. As I said, we're trying for wider media in this campaign, and let's hope that we will get it. Elaine asks whether there are religions other than Christian listed on the census who are likely to have people ticking their boxes because of cultural affiliation or identity. So other than Christians, are there other religions where people might tick a box because of cultural affiliation rather than actual religiosity? The answer is absolutely yes. All of the religious categories are artificially inflated by the leading nature of the question. So if you ask the question, what is your religion? Just as you get people who tick Christian who would otherwise tick no religion, you get people who will tick Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Buddhist, all the religions really, Hindu, who would otherwise, with a different question, have ticked no religion. There is no religious cultural affiliation box that wouldn't be reduced in number if the question that was asked were, do you see yourself as belonging to any particular religion? Do you have a religion? Yes or no? If so, what? In every religion, there would be a reduction in that. And that's it's not difficult to see why. The same cultural affiliations, cultural affinity, sentimental attachment or family connection or ethnic connection that might be felt by someone who had a Christian upbringing, who went to a Christian school, who was baptized, might be felt by someone from another religion who also had those attachments, family background and affiliations. The Christian category is the most overinflated simply because of the numbers involved, but all religious categories are artificially boosted by this flawed question. Moira asks whether the census data has adversely affected our lobbying for legal humanist marriage. Yes, absolutely it has. Until we had the example of humanist marriage working and large numbers of people choosing humanist marriages in Scotland and Northern Ireland, we were often rebuffed with references to the low proportion of people who wrote humanist in the census, for example. Someone asks if we would also campaign for apostasy to be included in the census. So, for example, having a question in England and Wales, like the question that's, for example, in Northern Ireland, saying asking if you were raised in a religion, yes, no, what, and then are you currently belonging to religion, yes, no, what? Yeah, we have lobbied for that in the past in England and Wales, and we think it would be a good idea because it would be interesting in itself as data, but it probably would also help with the planning of resources. I think we've got 3 more questions before we end. So Philip here wants to know who in government is protecting religious interests by refusing to change this question. Well, I think that probably the not changing the question probably has a different motivation from asking the question in the first place back in 2001. So I think that now it really is the statistical authorities, the Office of National Statistics, who don't want to change the question because they want comparability over time. And I think that's something they just believe in as statisticians more than anything else. Originally, it was obviously aspects of the Labour government at the turn of the century who just, because they were interested in questions of religion, it was under their government, after all, the expansion of faith schools to include greater numbers, particularly of non-Christian schools, was envisaged. They wanted this data, and they wanted to maximise the religious returns because they wanted to pick up, a bit like in Northern Ireland, wanting to identify, how many Catholics and how many Protestants. They really wanted to identify in the UK how many Hindus, how many Sikhs, how many Muslims, because that was a particular category they wanted to disaggregate for all sorts of policy reasons. And so that was the original motivation. There are some questions here that are not about the census, some of which are very interesting, but unfortunately we don't have time for that, but we have lots of other events at which you can ask questions. The point is made that the simple religious affiliations that are recorded in the census capture a very wide a range of beliefs, and that's true. I'll end with this question because it's a good conclusion. I'm really motivated to get involved with this campaign. How can I help? Are there resources and fact sheets available? This is really simple. The most important thing you can do is that if you don't believe in or practice a religion, then when you're asked about your religion on the census, tick no religion. But we're also asking people to help spread the word on their own social media, help place stories in their local press. If you do have access to local schools that are learning about the census, then you can offer to give talks online to school pupils about this aspect of the census. More important, though, is to get into media channels and spread the word about the need to tick no religion. If you are interested in being involved in that further, then you can email us at campaigns@humanists.uk. That's campaigns@humanists.uk, and we can provide you with more resources. You can also go online, find the census campaign pages, and find resources there. Thank you very much for all of your questions. Thank you very much for being involved and helping us produce this video. And remember, if you're not religious, say so, tick no religion in the 2021 census, and please help us explain to others why it's really important that they do the same. Thank you.